Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of React Native Radio. Today on our panel, we have Chris Reyes.
Hey everybody.
Charles Max Wood.
Hey folks, quick reminder, the book is now going to be out in paperback because I know this is going to go out at least a week from now. So go check it out, Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job.
And I'm Josh Justice, and we're your panel for today.
Infinite Red is a US-based consultancy specializing in React and React Native. They do mobile app and web design and development. They are deeply involved in the React and React Native open source communities, publish the React Native newsletter with 10,000 subscribers, and are involved with the React Native core development. If you have a project and need design or engineering help from an experienced team to take it all the way from concept to completion, get in touch with Infinite Red. You can find them at infinite.red. Make sure to mention you heard about them in this ad.
So today we're going to be talking a bit philosophically about the React and React Native ecosystems and the approach to small libraries and assembling your own stack of libraries for your application. That's pretty much, as far as I understand it, the React and React Native world philosophy. I'm interested to hear y'all's experience if you've experienced anything different. But there's an alternate philosophy that I've seen in a few other programming ecosystems. And I'd love for us to just discuss the pros and cons of how they work. So the other philosophy I've heard referred to as a batteries included approach, or in the Ruby on Rails world in particular, there's a phrase called Rails is omakase, which we'll talk about in a second. And it's really the idea of, I've also heard it referred to as libraries versus frameworks. People use those phrases in different terms, but one thing that people say is, oh yeah, a library is like, it's just one thing. I've heard React described as React is a UI library. Its concern is handling your UI, but not your entire application. React expects you to pull in other libraries to put it together, data layer, web service, connectivity, things like that. Whereas in a batteries included approach or with a framework, it's more a sense of, hey, this has everything you need for maybe the 80% use case. There's like an option for everything included. And so Ruby on Rails would be one example of that because it includes like an ORM for database access and database connectivity. You can render the server rendered pages. You can build APIs and do serialization there. It's been adding more and more stuff actually in the last few years for running asynchronous jobs and sending emails, receiving emails. So Rails tries to give you as much as possible out of the box. And something that may be more familiar to our listeners is Vue.js on the web. So Vue is another very popular front-end library. And Vue takes the approach where the Vue core team doesn't just create the UI library. They also create a CLI tool that will build your app for you. It uses Webpack. You don't need to set up Webpack yourself. They have a Redux equivalent for the data layer called Vuex. They have testing utilities. I guess React has testing utilities as well, and a few other options, all built in, all maintained by the core team. So yeah, I guess before we get into anything else, does the concept of like library versus framework or batteries included versus not, does that make sense to y'all? Has that been your experience with React and other ecosystems you've worked in?
Yeah, it totally does. And, today reading up for this, it's one of those things where, we always see these comparisons of React and Vue and Angular. But, at the end of the day, we forget that, React is a library where the other two are frameworks. So React is meant to kind of give us that option to kind of pick and choose what we want and add that customization. So that's kind of where I always fall and forget when, you see these framework articles and the comparisons.
Yeah, I think for example, Create React app is more in line with omakase than React itself, just because it pulls in all those pieces, even though they don't maintain them. So I guess it's semikaze, for lack of a better term. Angular's kind of the same way, right? They give you the view layer and, kind of a framework for building, the services and things like that. And, they expect you to use TypeScript. But yeah, if you need like a data store or things like that, you're going to wind up pulling that in. And those are all third-party libraries. So it's also, in my opinion, semikaze. But yeah, because they're not on the level that Rails is, where, Rails gives you all the pieces, but they're all maintained by the core team. And Vue is also the same way, like you said. So I think React is less omakase than Angular is, just to kind of put the comparison out there. React Native, though, itself is also kind of interesting because it seems even more Wild West-ish than React. And you're dealing with, third-party platforms that aren't the browsers They're actually native libraries and CocoaPods and things like that are, they're not even maintained by people who do React in some
Yeah, and that is such a good point because there's such a vast ecosystem for React Native. I mean, when it comes to styling, you can do native base, you can do React Native elements, and there's about 9 other out there for styling alone. And same thing with routing. So that's what's interesting for React Native. So, I mean, like you said, it's a little bit more of a wild, wild west. In terms of the React Native ecosystem, have you guys come across some of the challenges of where you choose routing or styling, or is there a strict kind of guideline you like to follow in terms of selecting these packages?
It's interesting. I've started developing in my head the idea that, theoretically anybody could choose anything in React Native and in React, but in practice, most of the time, many of us are using most of the same libraries. But the thing is, I've kind of been in my own head, in my own echo chamber, and my small team at work. And so it might just be that we, like the dozen of us or so, are choosing the same libraries. By the time I got into React Native, the common navigation libraries had boiled down to React Navigation, implemented in JavaScript mostly, and React Native Navigation, which has some more code on the native side. And for my purposes, React Navigation has always been fine. That's what I've reached for, just being in React Native in the last few years.
Yeah. What I've kind of seen there in some cases is that, people tend to settle on a particular set of libraries built on top of things, right? And so I could see an Omakase framework built on top of React Native, right, that incorporates some of these other open source projects and pulls things together. I think Expo kind of sort of does this. I wouldn't say that they fully embrace this. Infinite Red has a framework that is much more opinionated. I'm trying to remember what it's called, but
it's Ignite, and it was Chris's pick last week.
Right. And Ignite is much, it's much more in the vein of Omakase, right? Because it puts all that stuff together and ties it in nicely together and makes everything work, well together for, 80-90% of the apps you're going to build with it. So, things like that. I kind of like the direction of those things just because they also give you an easy way to get rolling, and they plug everything together, right? So they plug in the state management and everything else that sometimes are a little bit tricky to get together. So
I like what you're saying about the sliding scale of omakase-ness, because I think it's really helpful comparing Expo and Ignite. In my mind, Expo reminds me a lot of native iOS development in the sense that there's a lot of APIs exposed, but you're not given a lot of direction about how to hook your app together. And one big thing, maybe a lot of my thoughts on this relate to the data layer, because Expo, as far as I can recall, doesn't include Redux or MobX or Apollo or anything out of the box. And so you have these pieces, but hey, the way you want to assemble it is up to you. And that's very much the case on iOS as well when I've done native development. Whereas Ignite, I've only used Ignite a little bit and I haven't gotten in, but as I'm looking at the page here, I see that they mentioned generators, I want to generate this or that type of aspect in my app. And if that to me slides more in the omakase or convention direction. If it's saying hey, here's a way to generate something, and here's the standard way to put it. I see generate screen, generate component. So even that idea of the concept of a screen, which is, I imagine, just a component under the hood, but they're adding some more conventions there. Chris, does that match up with your experience of Ignite? Am I describing where it sits on the spectrum well?
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I kind of recommend. If you have done an Expo app and you're played around and you want to transition into, having that wider React Native CLI experience, I think Ignite's a good next step in that direction because it gives you those standards that are put in place and, that generate component and generate screen. For example, when you do the generate screen command in Ignite, it places that specific component in the screen directory. And then if you do generate component, it moves it to a component directory and then it sets up all of the imports and exports for you. So that's why it's such a beautiful tool. And if you're kind of getting started in React Native and you're ready to move on from Expo, it's such a nice transition.
The philosophy of Ignite is very appealing to me. I mean, my background, I just really like these batteries included tools. And for the kinds of personal and consulting projects I work on, they work really well. I think the thing that's made me hesitate on Ignite myself is it's funny because I say I just want conventions. I want the community to decide. And then Infinite Red comes in and says, cool, okay, Ignite, our Bowser stack, our latest stack, it uses MobX state tree. And I'm like, oh, no, not that. No, I want the community to decide, but I want the community to decide on Redux, or I want the community to decide on MobX instead.
Yeah.
And so like, some of it comes out of where I work, like working as a consultant, like I would need to advocate for this to the clients that I'm creating the projects for, or, we do training on React and React Native as well. And so since Redux has such higher adoption, like I tend to often reach for Redux more quickly. And yet now that bumps me out of the, the happy path, the Ignite path that Infinite Red is on. Like, hey, we've got this maintained boilerplate and we're ready to go. So there's contradictions in my own mind on how I think about these things. Also, looking at the list of boilerplates page for Ignite, there's 3 supported by Infinite Red at various times, and then a number of third-party ones as well. So it reminds me of that XKCD comic where it's like, hey, we need a standard. And now like there's a number of different standards. Look, great, we have a bunch of different standards.
Yep.
That kind of gets at the philosophy of the community, I think, that influences it, where, Vue started from, from the start, but from when I got involved in Vue.js, they were definitely moving in a direction of having these various things maintained by the core team. I think Vue test utils even was just an independent library, but the maintainer joined the Vue core team and it was rolled in as an official Vue project. So, given that React has started and continued and has the intention of staying as sort of a standalone library, it makes sense that React and React Native, like, who is the entity that would kind of coalesce some standards around it? It makes sense that Infinite Red in the React Native space does play a pretty influential role. And so if anybody could do it in React Native, they or CallStack, I feel like would be the ones.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, they just have so many tools out there. I mean, in terms of tooling, and it kind of gives them that leverage in the community. I think I mentioned Reactotron last week too, which is another great developer tool if you're kind of getting into it.
Yeah.
So, obviously they have that perspective where if there is going to be a standard, they have the experience to kind of influence it heavily. And that might be, in terms of React Native, Expo kind of sets you up with that single folder in app.js where, if you're getting started, that's your standard, And then with the React Native CLI, it's a little bit more open for you to kind of, your classic kind of create React app. Well, they'll abstract some of the stuff, but the rest is up to you to kind of pick and choose what you like and what you don't want.
When I'm building a new product, G2I is the company that I call on to help me find a developer who can build the first version. G2I is a hiring platform run by engineers that matches you with React, React Native, GraphQL, and mobile engineers who you can trust. Whether you are a new company building your first product or an established company that wants additional engineering help, G2I has the talent you need to accomplish your goals. Go to devchat.tv/G2I to learn more about what G2I has to offer. In my experience, G2I has linked up with experienced developers that can fit my budget, and the G2I staff are friendly and easy to work with. They know how product development works and can help you find the perfect engineer for your stack. Go to devchat.tv/G2I to learn more about G2I.
Maybe let's talk a bit about the kind of philosophy behind these approaches, because I think this gets into, I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts on the pros and cons. Like, do you have a strong preference one way or the other? What are trade-offs for people to think through when they're thinking, even in the React Native space, like, should I assemble my own stack or should I go with, Ignite, and what are the trade-offs there? So if you look at so I mentioned Ruby on Rails as a really influential framework that took this approach. Maybe they took this approach even stronger than many others. So DHH, the creator of Ruby on Rails, a few years ago wrote a document called the Rails Doctrine. So we'll put that in the show notes. But this describes kind of the philosophy behind how they've run Rails as a project. And one of the items on there was the menu is omakase, as I said. And so this is a point really saying that it was not an accident that they took this approach. It was very intentional. And just to summarize some of what it says in there, omakase refers to the idea that you let the chef choose. I think it's Japanese cuisine term. And it's the idea that you don't have to be an expert in the cuisine, or in this case, like the platform. And you don't need to just just take blind luck and just guess out of the blue, but you're getting good recommendations, things that'll fit the 80% use case, things that will be a good choice. And as a part of that, you offload so much of the mental effort required, like, okay, I'm new to front end, I'm new to React Native, I guess I need to learn Redux, I need to learn MobX, and then MobX state trees kind of in between. And then there's 10 other, state libraries that various people are maintaining and saying is much better than these. And like, do I learn about all of these and then pick one? Do I just take what somebody else mentioned to me or whatever seems to be the latest? Am I going to regret it and need to roll it back and put a new one in? And so just the idea that like hey, unless you have specific constraints, like this set of libraries together, this set of tools together is going to work well for you. You can get support because now you're not asking questions about how these three libraries work together and hopefully somebody is using them together. It's like, no, like I'm using Rails or I'm using Ignite Browser. And so, everybody else who's using it has the same set of libraries together. So yeah, that's the safety in numbers aspect they mentioned there. People are perfecting the same basic toolbox. So Ember.js is another library that takes this approach, and they use the phrase shared solutions a lot. Let's work together to build shared solutions so that we can all benefit from them. And then a last point on here is that substitutions are still possible, but not required. And that's an important point because if the substitutions are not possible, you're really locked in. So yeah, I'm curious for y'all in React Native and in other ecosystems you've worked on, does that, do the benefits of that approach, like, do they sell you? Do you buy into that? Or do you feel like there's a lot of downsides to that would make you want to stay to an approach of kind of selecting your own tool set yourself?
So, I mean, I've spent quite a bit of time working in Ruby on Rails, and I've also spent a bunch of time with Angular and Vue, not as much time with React, incidentally. And I'm actually doing a challenge right now to learn Vue. So just putting all that out there. It's one thing that I found is that the convention over configuration is nice in the sense that, yeah, there's kind of a Rails way of doing things or a Vue way of doing things, right? And so that is very freeing because those are decisions I don't have to make. So I get in and I just kind of work the way that the community or would expect me to work, right? And somebody else can come along and they can make certain assumptions and they're probably going to be right about the way that I did it. The flip side is that with a lot of these, Ember's another one that comes to mind that's fairly opinionated, and Omakase was actually very closely related in design to Rails. The issue is that sometimes you wind up straying into that other 20%, right? So you wander off to the other 20%, and sometimes it's easy to pull in whatever it is that you need to get that other 20%. And sometimes it just goes so heavily against the convention that you need a different tool. And so that's kind of where you run into issues more than anything else. I mean, the nice thing about JavaScript and Ruby and some of the other languages that we're talking about is that they're flexible enough to allow you to build the rest of the solution, right? Or you can go pick up another tool, like if it needs to, scale across processors or something like that, you could actually build a service in Elixir or something, right? And scale it out that way. So there are always options for that. And so if the majority of your work fits in the convention paradigm that you get from the project, then you're in good shape. But sometimes you're just going to get in, you're going to figure out, you know what, it makes these things easier, but we're doing enough of these other things to where we're going to need a different tool. And so that's the flip side. That's the dark side, I guess, of some of these opinionated Omakase systems. But then again, Vue and Rails and a lot of these others make it really easy to pull in something else and deviate from that some. So that said, it's not, I guess it's not a deal killer because most of the time you can get to 90% of use cases by pulling in a separate tool. And then if you're just out there in the other part of whatever, your requirements don't line up, then you can find another tool to fill the gap, or you can find another tool to do the work and then use, Vue or Rails or whatever to fill the gap that you have. So
yeah, I'm coming from the other end of the spectrum. I don't have a ton of experience with Vue or Rails, but just from my reading of like the Vue docs, you do have that flexibility where if you wanted to use JSX or, I think Redux, you can plug them in. So that's what's kind of cool about that approach, because it does kind of go along with that safety in numbers. Like if you want to pull in a popular library, you can kind of use that point to kind of pull in something that is popular. But I think one of the beauty of React and React Native is the diversity and decentralization of it, where, with some of the more stricter kind of convention-based apps, it might be a little bit more difficult to code share, where in React Native and React, you can have those shared components that you pull into a couple different apps. So, like I said, I'm coming from an outside perspective here, but in terms of code sharing in Ruby and Vue, has that been an issue at all for you guys, or was it something that it's still pretty doable?
I think the thing that comes to mind for me is like there are definitely mechanisms in Rails and in Vue to share code across multiple projects.
Hmm.
Certainly with React Native, one of the big things that comes to mind is sharing code across React for the web and React Native on native, which is unique. Most maybe less because of React's architecture and more because of just the fact that it exists and is very highly adopted on native platforms. At the same time, there could be an architectural reason for that. I mean, Facebook did not need to implement a whole batteries included stack on native. They needed to implement a UI layer on native, and they carried that over. And just the fact that it was loosely coupled, that it was just JavaScript function calls, and even just React's architecture that, hey, you're just, things are just functions. They're called, it's props and state is being passed around, and you call a function inside your function if you want. Now we have hooks as another way to do it. So I think the simplicity, that very loose coupling there in React, I think is something that has allowed for a lot of the experimentation as well. I mean, this relates to what Chuck was saying about how easy it is to substitute other things. If you have a poorly designed plugin architecture, and I've never made a plugin architecture, so I can't judge, but if it requires a lot of work to build a plugin or add on to your Ember engine, Rails engine into your application, then it's just harder for people to substitute something in. Whereas in React, it's like, hey, just any JavaScript library, call the code, and you're good to go. There's a flip side to there as well, where when your add-ons, your plugins can have a lot of knowledge and make a lot of assumptions about how apps are generally set up, they can do a lot powerfully. Whereas in Rails, in React Native, it can't make assumptions about what you're doing. And so like, hey, just give me the props, just give me pass down the state as props to me, or make function calls, and I'll go from there. So there's benefits and downsides to the loose coupling there, but certainly if things are tightly coupled, then that just makes it harder and harder to make substitutions and build, sub out things that are built into the framework or something. It's the data layer in particular, I think, with React that I find, I just see the diversity going around a lot. Like, Redux is pretty popular, but not everybody uses Redux. It's not included in Ignite's default stack. And even within, I feel like it's so egregious, even within Redux, if you want to do something asynchronously, like most of us do, reading from a web service, you've got to decide how to do it. Like, are you going to do that work outside of Redux? Are you going to use Redux Func, Redux Saga, Redux Observable? A consulting project I showed up on had Redux Observable. I hadn't used it before, and so when I joined on the project, I needed to learn Redux Observable and RxJS, which I hadn't learned before. So that was some ramp up time, which incidentally, the Vue.js project that I had been on, other than some unique things about how it was set up to connect to native macOS code, it was all a completely stock standard Vue implementation. So everything I saw in the Vue guides was exactly the way the application was built. So that's some interesting ramp up benefits there. But yeah, Chris, I'm kind of curious, like when you see the state of kind of data layers in React, do you feel like the variety there is helpful or needed? Do you feel like we'd be better served if just more and more of us were standardized on something, or maybe we are all standardized on Redux mostly? What are your thoughts on the diversity in the React data layer?
I had such mixed emotions about this. Because part of me, I love the diversity and going out and obviously based on business requirement, picking and choosing what fits your needs best, But then, in these situations, I always find myself gravitating towards like an Ignite, or when I'm on a team trying to develop a standard approach just so we're all on the same page. So I think that's what I really, do love about React Native and React is the flexibility. But it's one of those things where it's a blessing and a curse because, I've gotten myself into some sticky situations to say the least. But, I think in terms of the data layer thing, it seems like for a while there, Redux has had the monopoly on the market, really. And we've seen that not so much shift, but with hooks coming in the context API, there's been a pretty interesting development in terms of how that's all changing. Because, it felt like about a year ago when I opened up my Medium, I saw about 3 or 4 articles about how we're not using Redux anymore. So it's definitely an interesting environment because when we're talking about this approach in terms with Rails and Vue versus the React and React Native and picking and choosing your stack, that's kind of the issue with React is you do have to focus a little bit more on keeping up, or the other two, you can pay a bit more attention to convention. So that's, like I said, coming back around again is one of the great things about React, but if you don't control it, it can end up controlling you.
The point about effort to keep up is a great point, because another unique thing about me working in consulting is like I need to and want to keep up on the variety of things happening in the React world, because I don't know if I'm going to get a contract with some existing code base that's using MobX State Tree or Apollo or whatever. So it's already something I've decided that I'm excited about, is like learning a variety of different tools. So despite my leanings towards batteries included, like my consulting work and my kind of just excitement about learning at this point in my career is making me like the downside of having to keep up with React is much less for me right now. Whereas for somebody else, hey, if you're at a product shop or your just personal life just means like, hey, you're not looking to read blog posts and listen to podcasts on the in your free time. Thankfully, all you listeners are listening to our podcast here, but maybe this is the only one. So yeah, I think like knowing whether you're excited about all that stuff. I think another thing that comes to mind there is just that React's looseness here makes it a great ground for experimentation. So given that everybody's going to need to choose a data layer anyways, or no data layer, choosing React context. If you want to make your own data layer with the new approach, React is the place to do it. Whereas in Vue, in Ember, there's a default. And so it's a bigger barrier to get people to try something new. People do, but it's just like when 80-90% of the people are all using the standard is very different than even if it's just 50% of React developers that are using Redux. There's a lot more possibility. There's just a marketplace of ideas. And I will say when I work in convention-based frameworks, I'm glad that React folks are experimenting so that they are, I would say sometimes, maybe experiencing some of that cost and the churn of, I tried this new library. It has a bunch of benefits. Oh, it got abandoned. It's actually not being maintained anymore. Or, we ran up against a performance wall and we found that this was not needed. Or another thing would be, something that I've heard about RxJS and Redux Observable is, it sounds really great, but like for a lot of purposes, you might just need Redux Thunk. One of the maintainers of Redux, I asked on Reactiflux recommendations about an async middleware for Redux, and his view was that most of the time, Thunk is enough. Most of the time for what you're doing, that's all there. So like that's the situation you can run into where the tool you chose is great, but it's overpowered for what you're doing. And so you're just experiencing the cost of being on a less adopted tool without the benefits of the power it provides. I shared a few different thoughts there, but yeah, like that's some of the impacts I think of the marketplace of ideas in the React world.
Hey folks, this is Charles Max Wood, and I just launched my book, The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. It's up on Amazon. We self-published it. I would love your support. If you want to go check it out, you can find it there, The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. Have a good one. Max out. I'm just wondering, is there a good Omakase option for React?
In terms of React, I guess if we're talking whole app, for certain, the only thing that comes to mind right now was it MERN-Stack, right? You get your Mongo, Express, React, and Node.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in terms of full app, that's the big one I always hear. And then if you're talking GraphQL, there's, I really like the Apollo stack. I might be a little biased though, but I know Relay is really popular as well. I think, Josh, haven't you worked with Relay? I thought that was you I was talking.
No, I have not worked with Relay myself. Must have been someone else.
Might have been Thomas on React Roundup.
Yeah.
To work at Facebook.
Yeah, that probably is it. So, I don't know a ton about Relay, but it's one of those things where it would be nice if Facebook was like, hey, this is our stack, go for it. And maybe it is out there and I just haven't seen it. But, when we're kind of talking about this stack and if there's a good Omakase option, because of its flexibility, it almost seems like it seems shop to shop or kind of app based, so if you have like a real data driven app where you're just filling out forms and doing stuff, I've seen like library combos where, you're using, Redux for state management, using Redux form for validation. And then, you have like your standard Bootstrap, whatever. But I haven't really seen anything official where big companies come out and has been like, this is what we're doing, guys. Everybody jump on board, But I know in terms of React Native, if you go to the native-based website and React Elements, they have just such good Expo apps for you to look at and see what they're doing. And so I definitely recommend those. I'll have to link that in the show notes.
I guess when I look at a lot of this, I don't know that we can really get like full on Omakase. I guess it's just that, somebody has picked your framework for you. But for me, like, the state of state management and the state of some of these other things are still like GraphQL seems straightforward enough, using Apollo. But state management in particular, it gets complicated in a big hurry. I mean, even with good tools, the good tools that we have, it still gets complicated in a big hurry. And so I look at it and I go, okay, well, we need a better convention around this. And so, if there was more than just use Redux or what have you, MobX, and instead it's, use Redux and here's the convention for using Redux to make your life simpler and know how to just do stuff, right? That to me would get us a little bit closer. But as I see it, a lot of people wind up using Redux and then they use it in a way that makes their life harder, that complicates things. Or, MobX, I see that a little bit less, but still, I still see it, where people run into issues because they've overloaded what Redux or MobX was supposed to do for them. And then it gets messy and they're not following a good convention for it. And so I think Omakase, where somebody picks the technology for you, isn't quite enough. I think you need that convention over configuration where somebody's saying, look, this is where these pieces live, right? So this goes into this kind of Redux setup. This goes into more of a standard services library or something like that. And this is where you use your shared components. This is where you use your custom components. You kind of get the idea. So where everything stacks up, where to put it, and how to put it together.
I totally forgot, but I just remembered that Artsy, very influential organization in the React Native world, actually has an Artsy Omakase stack that they have. And
nice.
Orthotherox gave a talk on it. It looks like about 8 months ago. And so it's interesting. Like you think through the list, it's like, hey, React, GraphQL, cool, yeah. Visual Studio Code, they actually standardize on their editor, which is interesting. Not a lot of folks do that. Not a lot of organizations. Jest, Storybook, styled components. I'm like, cool. Like there's a lot of adoption there. Mm-hmm. TypeScript. Well, TypeScript is very popular. I feel like in the React world, that's kind of split. Like there's a lot of React folks that don't use it. Certainly the Facebook team themselves don't use TypeScript. So it's like, cool, popular, but not that big. They have Relay as well, which I have felt like I've heard much more adoption of Apollo than of Relay for GraphQL. And so that's another one that, just like with Ignite, where I'm like, hey, cool, I'm on board. Standards, this is great. Oh, we're using MobX State Tree. Like, I might actually like that, but like it's adopted much less than Redux. How do I feel about that? In the same way, okay, they're using Relay. I'm sure it's the right choice for them. Do I want to get into Relay when Apollo has so much, in my experience, so much greater adoption? So yeah, it's interesting. But I think checking out the talk on Artsy Omakase would be great, and it's a great way to get a sense of why Artsy finds the benefits of that standardization, at least within their organization.
Yeah, going back to talking about shopping and choosing your stacks. I went over to the Native Base site, and I guess I haven't been here for a while because on the Kitchen Sink app URL, I'll post in the show notes. They actually have 3 examples you can choose from, and it has stacks. So they have their React Navigation sample app, one with Expo and Create React Native app, and then they just have a standard just React Native one. So if you want to kind of get started with your, that's kind of Semikaze, or what were you saying earlier, Chuck?
Semikaze.
I
totally made that up. So
yeah, I feel like I have to go. It's so close to Kamikaze. I have to say it once in this episode. So.
I've got one final thought, and then maybe if y'all have any wrap-up thoughts before we go to pick, you can share it. I would say, hey, this is an interesting perspective to share. If you are hearing this and you find like, wow, yeah, I really feel stressed by all the decisions I have to make in the React Native world and keeping up with all the different developments and things like that, then for you at least, like, just be encouraged that like other people feel that as well. And whether you can find a boilerplate to use or, a CLI like Ignite, or just kind of drifting towards tools and saying, hey, like, I'm sure Redux will be fine. It has high adoption. I'm sure Apollo will be fine. It has high adoption. I'm going to stick with those. Find a way to assuage that stress, because you don't have to, you do not have to keep up with all the latest developments to have a good React Native application. All of these, tools are really great. And so pick them yourself. And if you find that you're still just feeling a lot of pressure from having to kind of learn and select a bunch of tools, then find ways to reach out to community to get help there. Because React is a mature ecosystem, and so people have done research for you, and you can benefit from it even if you don't have a whole Omakase stack for yourself. Y'all have any other final thoughts before we go to picks?
No, I'm all good.
Yeah, I'm good.
Cool. Chris, why don't you start out? Do you have any picks for us this week?
Yeah, so talk about GraphQL. One of my first talks I really listened to was JavaScript Jabber, episode 246 with Yuri Goldstein. So it's a couple years old. If you don't know what GraphQL is, I just remember that episode was a real nice barrier to entry. Obviously, a ton has changed in those 2 years. So, that might be a good starting point. And then I don't want to steal a pick. I feel like this is going to be yours, Josh, the actual talk for Artsy done by Orther. So that's probably going to be my other shoot. It's a good video on YouTube. Check it out. Less than an hour. And that's it for me.
Great. Chuck, how about you?
Man, I wasn't quite ready for this. I usually am. I usually have picks lined up, but...
Want me to buy you some time?
Nope. Actually, I remembered that I am picking Christmas movies. So I don't remember what I picked last week.
It was White Christmas and Holiday Inn, I think.
Awesome. Okay. So I have two more then, and I know what they are just right off the top of my head. Probably pick this week and next week Christmas movies, and then after that I have no guarantee that they'll come out before Christmas. So this week I'm going to pick two movies. One of them is an old Cary Grant movie, and people are often surprised. Oh, really? There's a Christmas movie with Cary Grant in it? Yep, there sure is. It is. It's called The Bishop's Wife, and it's an old movie. It's black and white. And it's this bishop. He feels called to build the cathedral in the town, and he's praying to figure out, how to make that happen. And what winds up happening is an angel sent, and the angel comes and helps him, figure things out with his wife and his congregation and his life and things like that. And it's a terrific movie, really, really good movie. And I don't remember how old it is. I think 1940s, 1950s. But yeah, it's one of those terrific black and white movies that are just amazing. And then another one that came out, incidentally, the year before the first movie I picked, which is It's a Wonderful Life, is Miracle on 34th Street. And yes, there's a newer one. I'm talking about the older one. I told you I was picking older movies. They're both actually really, really well done. I am a little bit get off my lawn-ish on some of the other older ones that have been remade. But this one, the remake was just as good as the original one. I really enjoyed them both. So Miracle on 34th Street. And I'm going to throw in a third one, and that is the old 28-minute long Boris Karloff, How the Grinch Stole Christmas. It's just, a cartoon animated. It's awesome. I really, really love that movie. The 2000 remake with Jim Carrey, it was good. Not as good, but it was good. And yeah, so I dig those. But yeah, so that one I'm a little bit get off my lawn because, dang it, that's just a classic. And, Jim Carrey's fun to watch in the other movie, but it's a completely different movie. So yeah, those are my Christmas movie picks this week.
Cool. I don't have Christmas movies prepared, but since you mentioned movies, it reminded me just a couple days ago, my family went to see Frozen 2. I have young daughters, and so this is a common thing. I had a friend once who a pop culture reference to Elsa came up. He's a single guy, and he was like, Elsa, like, she's in Frozen, right? And I'm like, Sam, I have small children. Like, there's two things that I know is that, like, death is certain and that Elsa is in Frozen. Like, there's no question in my mind.
Elsa is Frozen.
Yes. But yeah, we saw Frozen 2. I really enjoyed it. I should avoid saying too much in case it feels like a spoiler. But yeah, like, not a perfect movie, but a really, really enjoyable movie, and I'm loving listening to the soundtrack and stuff like that. So Frozen 2 is really great. I'll pick...
I have to pile on that one. When the song Lost in the Woods started, I literally shouted out in the theater. I couldn't help it. I was like, no way.
Yeah. Don't say anything else because we want people to have the surprise, but it was astounding. Yeah. All right. So my one other pick is I'm going to pick Redux Thunk, the Redux asynchronous library that we mentioned earlier. That maintainer of Redux recommended it if you're going to need asynchrony, as we often do, in our data layer. And what he said matches up with my experience that for most straightforward apps, unless you're doing things that are really robust or really fancy, or you really embrace the observable mindset, for example, that Redux Thunk will meet a lot of your needs. It has a very high adoption as well. And so, yeah, if you're new to Redux or you're just feeling stressed by all the options for an async middleware to add in, I think Redux Thunk makes a really great default choice. So I'd recommend checking it out. All right, I think that's it for this week. So thanks, y'all. That was a great discussion. I really enjoyed it. I hope it's helpful for our listeners as well. And we will catch everyone next week for another episode of React Native Radio. Thanks.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
See ya.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.